Welcome to the last session, number 6 for the first annual SPEAK Symposium. I am Dr. Rick Hofer, Director of the SPEAK Project at the University of Texas at Arlington. We're really looking forward to the great dialogue that we're going to have in this session and discussion around this important topic of how to amplify the voice of social workers in policy. And I'm really pleased with the two speakers who are here to present their viewpoints. Before we begin, I want to gratefully acknowledge the support of Simmons Sister Fund at Texas Women's Foundation, who support SPEAK with a very lovely donation. We want to acknowledge the land on which our buildings stand, that it's unceded and stolen territory from the native peoples in this area. We also acknowledge the grave harm brought by colonialism to this land, especially the systematic attempts to erase indigenous and African identities through slavery and racist segregation laws. Well, now I'd like to turn to introduce Jessica Ritter. Dr. Jessica Ritter is professor in the Department of Social Work at Metropolitan State University of Denver. Her career as a social worker and academic has been dedicated to child welfare and children's rights, as well as political advocacy related to issues of social and economic justice. Dr. Ritter has been teaching social work at the college level for 13 years. She's a Fulbright scholar, and she's the author of 2 books, 101 Careers in Social Work, 2nd edition, and Social Work Policy Practice, Changing Our Community, Nation, and the World. She also has another book, Introduction to Social Work, that she's just beginning to write. Dr. Ritter received her doctorate, Master of Social Work, and Bachelor of Social Work from the University of Texas, Austin. And so with that, Jessica, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hofer, for the invitation to be here. And I think this conference, I know it's the first annual one, and it's very exciting, and I'm sure we're going to see many, many more. So thank you for all of you for being here on a Friday afternoon. That's amazing. So one of the big themes of this conference, I know, is that the current political and social landscape really demands, I would argue, that increasing numbers of social workers get actively involved in policy work, political advocacy work. And there's so many pressing social problems that we could be addressing in those spaces: climate change, systemic racism, poverty and income inequality, voter suppression, and the list could be very, very lengthy, as we know. And I want to share with you a quote that I often use. I use it in my book, and I often share it with students when I teach policy. And it's by Marianne Mahaffey, a former social work professor. And she really, when she's trying to make this argument of why social workers should be involved in policy work, she really talks about that we have an important perspective and a value base that we bring into that work. So this is what she says. She says, a social worker brings to the political process something that's unique that no one else has. Anyone else can learn how to play the games, the power games. Anyone else can learn to negotiate. Anyone can learn to do the power manipulations. Those are techniques and skills that can be learned fairly easily. What the social worker brings is a value system that, if implemented along with the skills, makes the difference. And that really has always resonated with me and motivated me to want to be involved in policy as a social worker. Now, I'm going to take a different approach than I usually would take, and maybe perhaps a talk that's a little bit less academic than I normally would do. And it's really going to be more of a storytelling approach, and I really like stories. The policy book that I write also has a lot of storytelling in it. So I thought for a Friday afternoon, that might be a nice way to approach talking about this together. So I'm going to really tell my own story in some ways of how I have been engaged in policy work. And what the heart of my talk that I'll get to in a little bit are, I wanted to give 3 really good concrete examples of how I've been involved in policy work as a professional social worker. I always have found that when I want to do something and when other people talk about how they've done it, that's been really illuminating for me. So I hope that that's going to be the same for you. So I thought I would start with just a little quick background, just to show kind of a little bit of my journey and how I got there. So in high school, it's where I somehow, I don't really know why, I became really interested in politics. And I know that a lot of us have a very love-hate relationship with politics, and some people it's a hate-hate relationship with politics. But I was really inspired when I would see examples of really important policy or political change that would happen that affected lots of people, especially people who struggle and people who are marginalized. So I volunteered for my first presidential campaign when I was in high school and found that exciting. And one thing that I was inspired by, and I don't think I had this framework to think about it in this way, but now when I look back on it, I do, are, there have been these periods of time in our country, kind of these magical moments where big policy / social change has happened. And it seems like there's a formula in a way of a few pieces that are there when we see a lot of this change that's really important. And we often see social movements or advocacy organizations who are really pushing for change. That's kind of one piece of it. And then we have the right lawmakers that are there that want to support that kind of change. And sometimes that's the president of the United States or at other levels. And then it seems like there's something about timing. It's just the right time. And sometimes there's a crisis happening in the country that facilitates that, or there's just some other reason that it's just the right time. So I was paying attention to that and finding that really interesting and something that I thought I kind of want to be a part of that. Now, when I got to UT Austin, University of Texas at Austin as an undergrad, I was really floundering around with my major, couldn't figure out the right fit. But I started taking a lot of government and politics classes because that was where my interest was at that time. So again, the things that I was paying attention to in my classes, I was learning about the aftermath of the Great Depression, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president and the whole New Deal period. And so I'm just going to give you some ideas of what I found inspiring. So when I would learn about the Social Security Act of 1935 and how groundbreaking that was, and really, that was the time of our country where it was the creation of the social safety net in the United States. And then, moving forward a little bit, learning about the 1960s when Lyndon Johnson was president and the Great Society period, and all the civil rights movement, but all the legislation, the famous legislation that emerged out of that, the war on poverty, and the creation of Medicare and Medicaid. So again, finding that really inspirational. And then, of course, there were all these other host of different types of legislation, women's rights legislation, like the Violence Against Women Act of 1994, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. And again, there could be a really long list here of examples. Now, while I was in college as an undergrad, I ended up doing an internship with a state lawmaker. I was in one of my government classes, and they said that, wow, there's this opportunity where you can get class credit for doing an internship down at the state capitol. And I got very excited by that idea. So I interviewed with one of these state lawmakers, and he accepted me. So I spent a whole semester down at the Capitol. And that was really my entree into kind of being in this really interesting world where I was soaking it all in and really being in that environment. And I loved it. It was really great. But there was something pretty pivotal I learned. The one thing I knew about this state lawmaker when I first met him was that he had a law degree and he was a politician. But once I got to know him, he started sharing more about his professional background. And I learned he actually had a master's degree in social work. And I learned he was a community organizer. And he talked to me a lot about the intersection of social work and policy. And I had no idea. Social work wasn't really on my radar at that time. And I didn't know that social work had a macro social justice / policy side. So it was one of those really important light bulb moments in my life where I said, social work, that's it. So I changed my major as an undergrad to social work. And that was a pretty important part of my life. So now I want to move to just getting a little bit into my BSW and MSW education. So I came into social work education being one of those, I guess, kind of somewhat rare students who loves policy. And that's kind of why I was there, right? To kind of combine, my interest in helping people very directly, but also wanting to really engage in policy work. So in my policy classes, again, I'm really paying attention to these inspirational social workers. So the settlement house workers during the progressive era, who were helping a lot of the arriving immigrants of the day. One of my favorite famous social workers is Frances Perkins. I had never heard of her, and learning that she was the architect pretty much of the Social Security Act and doesn't really get a lot of credit. Many Americans have never heard of Frances Perkins. FDR tends to get a lot of the credit, but she's incredible. So if you haven't read her biography, I highly recommend it. And then learning about a lot of the African-American social workers like Whitney Young and others who were working in the civil rights movement and doing really important civil rights work. So that was great. I sort of had some models in mind of other social workers who had come before me who had done this work. Now, I will say in my personal life, because I think it's interesting to think about political work, and that when you're a social worker, sometimes you're thinking about doing political work as a private citizen. And then sometimes you're thinking about it being something you do as part of your job or as a professional social worker. So in the backdrop of all of this, even when I was a social worker and more my personal life, I was trying to be as active as I could politically. Mainly, I really enjoyed volunteering for campaigns, whether that be for candidates I was excited about from the local to federal level, but also issue campaigns. Sometimes there's issue campaigns that you could volunteer for, and I did that a few times as well. So that was something kind of going on in my personal life. But now I want to get into really the three stories. So I thought what would be helpful is I've had three experiences as a professional social worker where I did policy work in a way that I found really meaningful. And I think I found a way to have an impact. In other words, it made me feel good that I could do this work and actually have an impact in some way. So I want to go through each of those examples. And of course, once we open it up, I would love to answer any questions that you might have. So when I was living in Portland, Oregon, I joined the NASW Legislative Committee. So really, one thing that's important to know is that a lot of the state chapters around the country of NASW, almost all of them, I think, have a legislative committee. So I became chair of that legislative committee. And I have to say, this was something that I learned so much about policy work at the state level. So one thing that was really helpful is that there was a lobbyist that we were working with. And so she's, when you work with a lobbyist, you're going to learn a lot from them. So I worked really closely with the lobbyist at that time. But the kind of things that we did that just helped me learn and grow so much, really, when we were in session, when the state was having our legislative session, we were tracking all the legislation that was happening during that session, and we were creating a spreadsheet and deciding which of these pieces of legislation do we want to pay attention to and position on. So some of them we want to make sure that we're there and we want to support. Some of them we might be going and saying, no, we're arguing against. And then sometimes we might even have our own legislative proposal that we might be putting forward, right? And what I really got a lot of experience doing that was so important, and now I really build this into my policy classes, is the importance of going down to the state capitol and testifying in a legislative committee hearing on a piece of legislation. So we would also decide, on these bills that we wanted to focus on pretty heavily, who was going to go down and provide the testimony. And the nice thing is the lobbyist, we would write a piece of testimony and she would help us review it and make sure that it was, help us craft it. So I learned a lot about how do you craft a piece of a piece of testimony in a way that's not too long, first of all, but also is very compelling, and sort of all the rules around how to do that. So that was wonderful. I mean, when I'm thinking back over the years, it was everything from minimum wage legislation, arguing to raise minimum wage, all kinds of bills that impacted social workers directly, lots and lots of examples. But the other thing that we did on this committee that was really fascinating is I was also part of the Political Action Committee, the PAC. And that's where NASW at the state level has a certain amount of money that we can give to candidates running for public office and decide who we want to give money to. And so what was really cool about that is any candidate that was running for office at the state level in Oregon, if they were interested in having the endorsement of NASW Oregon, they would come in and we got to interview them. And so if you think about how we're often kind of intimidated by lawmakers, even though maybe we shouldn't be, it was sort of interesting because there would be a panel of us and they would come in and we kind of felt like we had the power. We would ask them questions about their positions on various issues. And they were really there to try to get our endorsement, right? And so that was pretty cool. And then after we would interview a bunch of them, we would decide, we had a certain amount of money, and how would we want to divide that up, and who would we want to give that to? So that was also really, really cool. So that's the first experience I wanted to share with you. And I'm going to keep looking at my stopwatch here just to make sure I'm on track here. So look, this is good. So the next example I wanted to share with you, so story 2, is that I became really interested in working with undocumented youth while I was living in Oregon. I had always paid a lot of attention to the DREAM Act, the federal piece of legislation that advocates have been trying to pass for a really long time at the federal level, and it still has not passed into law. It's been a very frustrating journey. But I found the young people, these young undocumented activists, I was paying attention to their activism, and I thought, wow, I haven't seen anything like this in a long time in terms of their bravery and their courage, and how they're putting themselves out there to try to get this law passed, and knowing that they're often risking, in other words, I know they always risk being deported when you're undocumented. So I started working with a group of them in Oregon, though, because then the focus shifted to state level legislation. And there were a couple bills in Oregon that I was gonna work together with this group to try to get passed, to give undocumented students in Oregon access to go to college, because there were a lot of barriers. One, they were having to pay out of state tuition because they weren't considered a resident of the state. And also they didn't have any access to state-based federal aid. So if you think how hard that is for college students to go and not have any access to federal or state financial aid, it's a pretty big barrier. So one thing that I learned, this was a new lesson for me, because previously a lot of my policy work had been around speaking up for groups that I care about. So using my voice, going down and providing testimony. And I think that's a really important thing for social workers to do. But what I realized is I had developed a skill that I could share with people on how to do that for themselves. In other words, I could help them write testimony, these young people that wanted to go down and testify at the Oregon State Legislature and tell their own stories. So I loved doing this work because they would write their testimony, and then I was there to kind of help them finesse it. And then also giving them support to lobby, right? To go down to lobby and tell their stories to state lawmakers. And so anyway, it was really wonderful. I will say, when you do work in the policy arena, sometimes things go your way and policies get passed very quickly. And sometimes you lose, right? You go down and try to pass a bill and it loses, and you have to keep going back session after session. And so there's a real lesson in patience and persistence when you do policy work. Luckily, I have to say, both of these bills ended up passing. So now today, as a result of especially these young people and their activism, undocumented students in Oregon can pay in-state tuition, and they now have access to financial aid at the state level, not the federal level. So that was huge. And I can't say how emotional it is for me to watch, again, the courage of people who were really impacted by various barriers in our society go down and courageously tell their own stories. So that's the second story I wanted to share. And then the third and last story I want to share with you today is I ended up joining a board called Children First for Oregon. And one of my big professional interests in social work has always been children's rights and child welfare. And that's how I started my career as a social worker, is in the child welfare field. So I thought I want to join an organization that's doing advocacy, policy advocacy work, really focused on kids, vulnerable children in Oregon. And this was really the one organization at the state level that was doing that work. So I reached out to them, asked if I could be on their board. And one thing that I learned that was such a cool part of this organization is they had something called the Foster Youth Connection. And this blew my mind, honestly, as I kind of walk you through how this works. But one thing that they would do with foster youth is they had a summer retreat where they would bring foster youth together, and they would talk about what are the biggest barriers and challenges facing foster youth in Oregon. And they would do a lot of brainstorming and sharing with each other, and they would come up with a legislative concept. The youth themselves would say, if we could pass a bill that would say X, this would help our lives tremendously, right? So I'll give you examples of bills, and all of these ended up passing. So there was one bill concept they came up with that would be a Bill of Rights, because they said foster youth often don't understand their rights. And they wanted to make sure in law that foster youth would have to be told when they're in their setting that they're living in what their rights are. There was also a sibling bill that would really speak to making sure that youth have to remain connected with their siblings when they're placed separately. There was also another really amazing bill that they should get free college tuition, that when you're a foster youth who ages out of the foster care system, that then you can go to a state university for free. And then there was another bill that basically extended healthcare coverage for them. Because if you think about it, what used to happen in the past, when a youth ages out of foster care, a lot of their benefits go away. And they were saying, whoa, we need a few years, we have to sort of go out and make our way in the world. It'd be really great if you could raise that age up where we could continue having healthcare coverage. And there were a couple more bills, but these were a number of the bills that they came up with themselves. And then I also did that same work I was talking about with undocumented youth, where I had a skill set in helping them tell their stories, helping them craft their testimony when they would go testify at a legislative hearing, and also how they would tell their stories when they go and talk to individual lawmakers and they're doing their lobbying work. So that was really, really incredible. I learned a lot again through that experience. So today, just to bring it up to today, I guess the way I think about another piece of my work is I teach policy. I was a practicing social worker for a number of years. I ended up getting my doctorate, and I realized that one of the ways I wanted to try to influence policy work from a social work perspective is I want to help students do this. So I teach policy classes. It's my favorite class to teach. I've written a textbook that I tried really hard to write a good book where students would feel like, after I read this book, not only do I have the competence to do policy work, but I have the confidence to do it, because it takes a lot of confidence sometimes. And I still just try to stay as politically involved as I can. So I'm just going to close here by sharing 3 lessons learned with you. So the one thing that I've learned over the years of doing work as a social worker in the policy arena is that policy advocacy can be really fun and energizing. I know we often think about it in a serious way, and it is serious work, but I think if you work with a group of people, you can build in a lot of fun. And when you get a win after all the hard work, it's like the biggest high you could ever get in terms of the energizing part of that. So the losses are tough, but the wins are incredible. I've also learned patience and persistence, because with many issues, we do have to try a number of times, sometimes before a bill gets passed. And so you have to kind of dust yourself off and keep going. And then finally, maybe the biggest lesson I learned is that even though I still want to keep using my voice, and I still like to go down and provide testimony on bills that I care about, and I'm kind of using my voice to speak up for others, I've learned in some ways about how to be an ally and how to share my skill set with groups so that they can go down and do their own advocacy and they can tell their own stories. So that was a pretty important lesson for me to learn. So I will go ahead and stop there. And I think I know we have another wonderful presenter here, and then we'll hopefully have some conversation later.
Jessica, thank you so much. I think as you point out, stories are an important way of disseminating information. And so hearing your personal stories, I think, brings home the lessons that you pulled out for us. And I appreciate you sharing all that information and your life history with us.
Thanks, Rick.
It's now my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Jerome Schiele. He is professor and chair of the PhD department in the School of Social Work at Morgan State University. Before arriving at Morgan State, he was professor and dean of the College of Professional Studies at Bowie State University and a professor and associate dean in the School of Social Work at the University of Georgia. Known primarily for his research in the area of Afrocentric social work, he is author of the seminal book, Human Services in the Afrocentric Paradigm. Dr. Schiele has published extensively in the areas of race, cultural competence, and social policy analysis, and he has over 30 years of experience as a social work educator and administrator. A native of Hampton, Virginia, Dr. Schiele received his bachelor's degree in sociology from Hampton University and his master's and doctoral degrees in social work from Howard University. His presentation today will be Social Policy, Advocacy, and the Afrocentric Paradigm. And Dr. Schiele, it's a pleasure to introduce you, and I very much look forward to hearing your comments today. I'm sure they're going to be very enlightening.
Thank you, Rick, for this invitation. I really I've read a lot of your work, and I respect your work. Thank you, Jessica, for your biographical method of reinforcing the significance of social policy and social policy practice. I have a story too, although I'm going to tell that story in traditional academic terms. Academia is storytelling. It just uses all of these weird concepts called paradigms. But anyway, I went straight through school. And so I practiced a little bit going through school, but I got my doctorate at 29. And so I've been basically an academic all my life. I've taught at 6 different universities. I've taught at predominantly white institutions, Research One institutions, and historically Black colleges and universities. So that range of experience has given me a lot to think about. But today, I just wanted to talk about the Afrocentric paradigm. If we had more time, I would engage you more. I would say, how many of you have heard of this paradigm in social work? Have you read anything about it? Is it just totally left field? You never heard of it before? It's outer space. Let's grab it from outer space and bring it to Earth. Earth to Jerome, Earth to Jerome. But anyway, I wanted to talk about the Afrocentric paradigm and in this relationship to social policy advocacy. I'm drawing on 3 books, references, one by myself and Phyllis Day, the 7th edition, A New History of Social Welfare. In fact, we were fortunate enough recently to get a book contract to do an 8th edition with Oxford University Press. I'm also going to draw on my first book, Human Services in the Afrocentric Paradigm, published by then Hayworth Press, if those of you remember Hayworth. And now we have a contract with Rutledge to do another edition. And then recently in 2020, I published an edited book by Cognella Press entitled Social Welfare Policy, Regulation and Resistance Among People of Color. So I'm drawing heavily from those 3 books. So let's look at what is the Afrocentric paradigm or the origins of the Afrocentric paradigm. Essentially, it emerged from a group of African-American social scientists, primarily psychologists and historians, who really were critically questioning the appropriateness of Eurocentric theories. And their whole critique was that the theories were not only inappropriate in explaining the behavior of African Americans, but also in trying to solve the problems and advance African Americans politically and, of course, socially. Indeed, many of these scholars believe that Eurocentric theories really was another form of instrument of advancing white supremacy in our society. And therefore, one book out of psychology that really chronicles the history of psychology in the United States by a guy by the name of Guthrie. The title was Even the Rat Was White, if you're a behavioral psychologist. So anyway, there was a major rejection of Eurocentric social science universalism. And again, we're talking about some of the early work in this paradigm in the 70s. It was people like Dr. Naeem Akbar, Dr. Wade Nobles, Dr. Linda James Myers, Dr. Malana Karanga, Dr. Malefi Asante, and others who were really beginning to advance this work, particularly in the 70s, and then accelerated in the 80s and the 90s. So these researchers felt and believed that that slavery had not destroyed all that was reminiscent of Africa for African Americans. Some of you might be familiar with the great debate between E. Franklin Frazier and Melvin Herskovits. And Melvin Herskovits was a Jewish anthropologist, and he argued that slavery did not destroy all that was reminiscent of Africa for African Americans. In fact, he argued that many of the relics had survived the transatlantic slave trade and still are with us today. On the other hand, E. Franklin Frazier, who was an African American sociologist, argued that slavery destroyed all of the cultural integrity of African Americans. Indeed, slavery served as a source of pathological evolvement for Black people and Black families. The Afrocentric perspective relies heavily on the work of people like Melvin Herskovits, and I would encourage you to read his book, 1941, The Myth of the Negro Past. It's a great book, and it really chronicles what some of the survivalisms of the African tradition. And then, of course, finally, as I said before, this group or cadre of scholars argued that these theories also attempted to advance white supremacy. I know we're getting a lot of coverage now about white supremacy, particularly, and I'm not trying to be political, but policy is political. But, you know, a lot of this has been highlighted during the former Trump administration. And, you know, that would be direct white supremacy. But what we're talking about here is intellectual white supremacy and the work of people like Lewis Terman and others who were part of the eugenics movement. Lewis Terman developed the Stanford-Binet test at Stanford University and argued that basically people of color were genetically and intellectually inferior. So, you know, there's a whole history in academia, Western academia, of advancing white supremacy as an intellectual dialogue. It first starts off, of course, in religion, but then it begins to mushroom with the advent of positivism and moving into the social sciences. And so this is one of the critiques of this particular group of people. And indeed, Eurocentric theories, you know, cast people of European descent and their interpretations and behaviors normative, while the experiences and interpretations of people of African descent are generally considered deviant, to say the least. So let's look at another piece. It's very important to understand that the Afrocentric, although it's centered in the Africanness and the cultural traditions of people of African descent, it is both particularistic and universalist. A lot of people think that the Afrocentric paradigm is solely or exclusively about advancing Black people. But indeed, if we really investigate and interrogate the traditions of African people, we know that there was always great concern for the other. And indeed, the other was not dehumanized or stigmatized as we see in some other traditions. So therefore, there is a kind of particularistic feature. Obviously, the paradigm is concerned about the problems that are disproportionately experienced, particularly by people of African descent here in the United States. But also the paradigm is concerned about advancing positive human and societal transformation for all people, regardless of their racial and ethnic identity. And that's a piece that we're going to talk about a little bit more as we move forward in terms of social policy advocacy. I also wanted to provide a definition of social policies from an Afrocentric perspective, and this is in one of the books I cited. I don't know, I forget sometimes. But the bottom line is that I wanted to offer this as a definition. Critical to this definition, as you can see, is that I'm trying to combine both the traditions of social treatment and social policy intervention, but also the tradition of what? Social control. And later on, we would call that control racial control as it relates to people of color, or racial regulation. So essentially, we're concerned about advancing those who are most vulnerable, particularly around eliminating inequality, or at least assuaging inequality, and helping people to meet their basic needs. And we're not just talking about food, clothing, and shelter, but we're talking about, overall well-being, like safety and civil rights, and those kinds of needs. So now we're moving into advocacy, social policy advocacy in the Afrocentric paradigm. Essentially, the paradigm underscores and prioritizes what I would refer to as a racism-centered perspective. And there are 4 elements of this perspective as it relates to social policy advocacy that I want to talk about today. The first is that a racism-centered perspective obviously underscores the role of white supremacy in social policies. There are a lot of textbooks in social welfare policy, and while they cover racism oftentimes is not seen as the primary, independent, or causative variable for the kinds of experiences that we have in terms of inequality. And so racism is prioritized with a racism-centered perspective. In many other textbooks, even racism sometimes is viewed as an epiphenomenon of other factors like gender and also social class inequality. So anyway, racism-centered perspective uses racism as an organizing theme to analyze social policies and provide policy recommendations. Obviously, when we think about the history of the United States, we have to think about what people call the original sin of slavery. And indeed, the first enslaved Africans were brought to my hometown, Hampton, Virginia, in 1619. So I grew up with a lot of this information. And unfortunately, I grew up at a time in those days where I experienced what I would refer to as severe racial antagonism. And perhaps we can talk about that too, as I grew up in the tail end of segregation. Second, a racism-centered perspective obviously highlights the inequality and oppression of people of color, particularly African Americans. And it also helps explain why people of color are disproportionately represented among, the poor and vulnerable and many social problem categories. We talk oftentimes in child welfare about disproportionality. We look at the criminal justice system. Some people say just us, not justice system, and hyper incarceration, or what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow of mass incarceration. So the racism-centered perspective also helps us to understand and explain that disproportionality in a way that many other textbooks may not be able to do. Third, and because of the emphasis on white supremacy, the racism-centered perspective also acknowledges the important role of racial regulation. We talked about in the definition previously that there was the acknowledgement of both social treatment and social control. But social control within a racial centered perspective is really racial regulation or racial control, which suggests that there are people, and that speaks to white supremacy, who benefit, unfortunately, from the subjugation and dehumanization of people of color. And they benefit psychologically, materially, and in all other ways. And therefore, the racism-centered perspective suggests that people don't want to give up those benefits. And therefore, in order to continue those benefits, another group of people or groups of people must be continuously subjugated. And then finally, a racism-centered perspective allows for the examination of the resistance methods of people of color. If we only focus on how policies have subjugated people of color, then we fall into the trap of exclusively acknowledging a victim's framework. But if we want to acknowledge a strengths perspective, then we have to acknowledge the multiple ways in which African Americans and other people of color or BIPOC people have resisted. And they've resisted basically in three ways. Number one, and this is not on the screen, but they've resisted in terms of nonviolent protests. So there are many protest movements. We're very familiar with, of course, the recent protest movements of Black Lives Matter, which, by the way, has been sponsored, and the leadership has really been African-American women. But of course, we know about the leadership of the 60s with Martin Luther King and others. So that was one way historically. Another way has been through group self-help. Because African Americans and other people of color were rejected, even by white social workers during the settlement house era, who were very progressive on social class and other issues and gender issues, but were not as progressive on race. And therefore, African Americans and others had to develop their own mutual aid societies, their own social welfare organizations, people like Ida B. Wells Barnett and others who developed those organizations. And then finally, and this is not written about a lot in social work, but sometimes people of color have used counter-violence as a way to resist oppression. The logic there is that we live in a violent society, and people of color are always victims of violence. In fact, according to the FBI uniform report, race is the major factor in terms of violent crimes and hate crimes. And so throughout history, some people of color in some groups have said, hey, we need to engage in counter-violence, or what Malcolm X called self-defense. And so we can talk about that too. I wanted to end with some Afrocentric social policy recommendations, just a few. And the Afrocentric paradigm of social policy would place these recommendations into two categories: universalistic policies and particularistic or race-specific policies. So oftentimes, these two are seen as diametrically opposed. However, the Afrocentric perspective converges them and acknowledges the significance of both. So a few universalistic recommendations which could affect all people would be enhanced educational opportunities. Not only, we know that one of the major ways in which people are able to advance themselves is through education. This is why some of you students are in school. And so not only trying to enhance financial aid, Pell Grants, and others, there are people in Congress, particularly the Republicans, not to politicize this, but it is political. There are some people in Congress who not only want to diminish Pell Grants, there's some people who even want to eliminate the Pell Grant system. And about a third to 40% of students, increasingly in some schools, over 50% of students who go to school are on Pell Grants. And they don't have parents like my parents who were able to afford to pay my college education and some of my graduate school education. Not everybody's fortunate like that. But also universal tuition payment, such as the plan in New York State. And I know that some of you are familiar with the New York State plan to pay for the tuition at state universities of residents of New York. Then also we know about Nixon's guaranteed minimum income plan by a Republican, which is interesting. But also the Afrocentric paradigm would support that. And again, Andrew Yang's universal basic income plan is something, for example, that we can hold up. By the way, Andrew Yang now has declared himself as an independent recently. Then universal healthcare coverage. This is very, very important, given the cost of care. We can talk about single payer versus a combination, but a lot of the proposals coming from Bernie Sanders, who really has pushed this thing and has made it more popular now than it was even 5 or 6 years ago. So hats off to Senator Sanders for that. Number 4, the expansion of childcare services. This is very important, not only for women, but for parents generally. And so the progressive Democrats have a proposal now within the broader infrastructure piece for free pre-K education. And the Afrocentric perspective would support that. But we also have some race-specific policies. This one, number 4, is going to be very interesting because it comes from what some people call one of the founders or the founder of critical race theory. And we'll talk about that later on. But obviously, HR 40, which was introduced way back in the 1980s. It's a bill that will establish a commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. This is highly controversial. But again, given the years of slavery, if you go with the 1619 date all the way to the 13th Amendment of 1865, you're talking about over 200 years and then another 100 years of Jim Crow, terrorism, and then still the manifestations that we see today. Some people argue that some form of reparations need to occur for people of African descent. The question is, what is the definition of a person of African descent? And that's going to be kind of murky too. Number 2, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2020 needs to be passed and will be supported by the Afrocentric perspective. Of course, we know about the tragedy of George Floyd. Gosh, man, I keep envisioning the knee, on his neck, and he's calling for his mama, ma, sad situation. But we need to have some kind of regulation, control over policing. I know a lot of police officers and I respect police officers. I really do. They do a great job, generally speaking. But we need some kind of control, some kind of regulation around police practices, especially some of the abuses that we have seen more recently, starting with, I guess, Trayvon Martin and others. Number 3, the Afrocentric perspective would support the continuation and enhancement of affirmative action policies, especially in higher education. Again, this higher education is the road of success for many people of color. And of course, there's been a lot of debate about whether race should be used in the admissions criteria, et cetera, whether standardized tests are racially discriminatory, like the GRE and the SAT. So there are a lot of issues there. And again, affirmative action is not only about and for people of color, but also one of the major beneficiaries of affirmative action over the last 20 to 30 years actually have been non-Hispanic white women. And there's some data to support that as well. And then finally, instituting the Racial Preference Licensing Act. Well, Derek Bell, who was a law professor at Harvard, is one of the founders of critical race theory, which has really gotten a lot of play now in the media. And I'm a person who watches different kind of news outlets. I love Fox News. I watch Fox News, although Sean Hannity can give me a heart attack sometimes. But I watch Fox News, and I think it's very important. Then I switch on back to, MSNBC, and I look at different shows, trying to get a fair and balanced perspective. So critical race theory has been given a lot of attention today. And Derek Bell wrote a seminal book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, The Permanence of Racism in American Society. And in the book, he kind of tells stories and fictional stories to reinforce the significance of racism and how we could respond to it in terms of policy recommendations. He argues that the civil rights movement and civil rights policies are really have not been established to advance people of color, but rather to protect the interests of people of European descent. He calls that interest convergence. And so with that in mind, he has a kind of fictional policy recommendation in the book called the Racial Preference and Licensing Act. So this is the deal. He says, for those who want to discriminate, businesses and others who want to discriminate against people of color, particularly African Americans, well, allow them to discriminate. But if they do discriminate, then fine them or tax them disproportionately and use the money to support educational initiatives and other initiatives that would help to advance African Americans and other people of color. That's very controversial. First of all, he says, acknowledge, that discrimination exists, allow the discrimination, but then penalize people by taxing them, using the proceeds to advance people of color in terms of housing policies, educational policies, and the like. So I encourage you to read that book. But the Racial Preference in Licensing Act, I think, is an idea for consideration, since there are a lot of people in our society who want to discriminate and would discriminate if the laws didn't prohibit them from discriminating. But if they discriminate, then use that as leverage to generate revenue to, for example, provide scholarships for people of color, African Americans, at, for example, the University of Michigan or at my alma mater, Howard University. Again, the references are here. Day in Schiele, Phyllis Day is so great. She brought me on to that project. And then my first book, Human Services and Afrocentric Paradigm, really takes the Afrocentric paradigm and applies it to various aspects of the human services. And then my more recent book, Social Welfare Policy, Regulation of Resistance Among People of Color, and hats off to Cassie Graves and her colleagues at Cognella Press. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I appreciate it again, Rick, for the invitation.
Jerome, what an inspiring and provocative presentation that you just gave. We've got several questions that have come in, but I want to just use my prerogative as the moderator to say both of these presentations, although quite different, have a lot of commonalities and questions I'm going to raise for both of you. There may be a question or two at one or the other of you, but I think that we could start off with the question about intersectionality. And Jessica, in the sense that you described your individual experiences and then brought some expansion of it for lessons learned, and Jerome in the sense that there are people who well, anyway, just intersectionality, race, gender, ethnicity, and other class kinds of things. And so, Jessica, let me just ask you first about this issue of intersectionality and how you think that impacts the lessons that you draw from your own experience. There's a big question for you.
I know, my mind is spinning in lots of directions here. Well, I'm so grateful for learning when I was able to learn about intersectionality, because there was a time even in social work education where I don't think we did, right? And it was such a helpful paradigm, to use Jerome's word there, to help us really understand all of those connections of various identities that people have. So I'm just trying to think about how I would relate it to the kind of things I talked about. I guess I'm thinking about a lesson. I'm going to try to sort of make a little bit of a connection here about how important it is when you're not necessarily part of a community, let's say, in terms of not understanding, not having the lived experience of folks, but you're involved in wanting to do advocacy work and be an ally. It's so important to be really grounded and connected to that community. And so I want to give you an example of something that I might not have thought of, but when I was working with undocumented youth in Oregon, the lobbyists that we were working with, they're usually very focused on, if there's a bill they want to get passed, they think very strategically about what's the right messaging and the right framing that's going to go over well with lawmakers. Because at the end of the day, they want the bill to pass. And so they had come up, and they were people that weren't necessarily from this community, right? And they're really smart people. And so they had sort of wanted to frame the issue up as like, they wanted people to have a lot of sympathy for these youth. And so they would say things like, they didn't do anything wrong, right? They didn't break the law. They didn't choose to come here without papers, let's say. Their parents are the ones that did that, right? Their parents were the ones that did this thing. And so they were sort of kind of wanting, and I think what they were really trying to do is they thought, well, if we could create some sympathy among lawmakers that makes it like these youth didn't do anything wrong, so they shouldn't be punished necessarily. And then the youth right away said, wait a minute, we don't like you talking about our parents that way. They said, we don't view it that way. Our parents did this for us for a better life. And then the lobbyists would come back and say, well, no, but I know, but this will help us in getting the bill passed. And they were like, no, but that's not our story. So I don't know, for me, it was just such an important lesson in how sometimes as advocates, if we are doing the work and we're not connected to making sure, the voices of those who are most impacted are coming in, sometimes we can be very well-intentioned and we think, we can just be very well-intentioned and not truly understand that would be a harmful message from the perspective of that community.
That's such an important point, that we're working with the community and not, and for the community and with them, but not just like we're the people coming in and saving the situation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. I should have started with an easier question. Sorry, just throw that at you. But Jerome's talk was really inspiring to me, and so Jerome, I'm going to turn the question kind of back on you, and to say, how does intersectionality and other kinds of things that we talk about in social work and sociology, how does that impact or add to the Afrocentric perspective that you're talking about?
Well, let me just say there is a debate in academia about the significance of intersectionality. Let's just start there. From an Afrocentric perspective, obviously race is considered what sociologists used to call a master status, right? And I hate to sound so academic today. I really need some Miller time later on, but a master status that while various forms of inequality are significant, there is this notion of differential vulnerability, right? There are some factors, some characteristics that place people more at risk of harm and humiliation. And so in another paper that I published some years back in the Journal of Social Work Education, I referred to intersectionality and this whole notion about equal oppressions as the equality of oppressions paradigm. This notion that all forms of oppression equally generate harm and humiliation for people. And that's not true. I mean, I just have to say that openly. All forms of inequality and oppression generate harm and humiliation, but some forms generate more historically and contemporarily. I cited the FBI's Uniform Crime Report. If you want to talk about hate crimes, the number one hate crime is motivated by race. With all due respect, not gender, not issues of LGBT and others. Those are rising and they're important. But so I think there's something to say too about not only intersectionality or intersectional forms of oppression, but also singular forms of oppression. And the notion of how some singular forms of oppression advance more differential vulnerability or more vulnerability than other forms. And I think we can empirically investigate that and provide some evidence to suggest that. But I don't want to sound overly critical of intersectionality. I think in terms of being more precise in describing the individual's oppression, sure, it's important to know that I grew up as Black. My parents were educated, so I had social class privilege. I'm a person of faith. I'm 60 years old. I grew up in Virginia. All of these things are very important to understand the human being and to understand their experience with oppression, because older people can be oppressed relative to younger people and vice versa. So I think as a model of precision in describing the individual is great. And I think, though, as a model to try to identify differential and acknowledge differential vulnerability is not so great. And that's what I would offer today.
Thank you. That's a very useful distinction to make. Thank you. Just, my mind is just like full of ideas and thoughts. And so if I'm less articulate than I'd like to be, I'm just.
Oh, no,
I'm impressed with you. Yeah.
It's great. Sometimes I get like that. You might need a little Miller time yourself, Rick.
Yeah, I was going to say, intersectionality, it seems like we apply that a little bit more in in the micro realm of our work. So I really hadn't thought about how that might apply to policy. And I really agree with a lot of actually everything that Jerome just said, though. So I'll have to think more about how it sort of applies in the policy world. But
well, this is the great thing about a symposium where we can talk to each other and listen to ideas that we maybe haven't heard. So again, thanks for being here. There's a question from Andrea, and let me see if I can summarize it a little bit. And it can go to both of you, but it was initially addressed to Jerome. In your opinion, what is the most impactful direct action a social worker who is not in policy making might implement into their daily practice in the interest of achieving the goal of influencing policy change at a state level? So someone's asking for directions, and what can we do?
You want to start, Jessica?
Sure, I'm reading the question here. So doing direct action work, who's someone who's not directly in policy making. Yeah, what's interesting? All of the work that I've done has been not in a professional job where I was getting paid. So when I gave the example of NASW and then working on the board of Children First for Oregon, doing that work with undocumented youth, that was all on my own time, so to speak. So, I think when we're social workers, we have to think about, one, do we want to do policy work where it is a big part of our job? And the best advice I give students who really want to do policy work as a social worker, my personal advice are advocacy organizations. I mean, that's really where I think you can get the most connected directly to people who are trying to influence legislation at the state or federal level. But let's say you don't want to do that. I have other kinds of social work I want to do, and I still want to fulfill my ethical obligation, though, to engage in social and political action, which the Code of Ethics does direct us to do. Then I think you have to think about carving out a little bit of time and space for service, right? I mean, really, a lot of that work I did, I would sort of put in the bucket of that was sort of service work I was doing. I wasn't being compensated for it. So it was in addition. All of that work was while I was a social work professor, actually. So I would think about trying to get connected up to an advocacy organization in your area that's doing work that you're passionate about, because I think all of us usually get involved in policy work based on issues that we're pretty passionate about, right? So that would be my advice.
I agree 100%. Micro workers, clinical workers, direct practitioners definitely should have a policy framework. As C. Wright Mills said in his wonderful book, The Sociological Imagination, personal problems are public issues. And so we always have to be cognizant that while we can focus on the idiosyncrasies of the trees, we want to look at the broader patterns of the forest. And I agree with Jessica, yes, find something that you're very passionate about. It could be related to your work, right? Let's say it's domestic violence, which is a major problem in American society, major problem. And let's say that's your passion. Maybe you've experienced it. Then I would hook up with an advocacy group or organization, as Jessica suggested, but also find some ways in which you can engage in that work on the job. Go to your supervisor and say, hey, supervisor X, Y, Z, whatever they are, I want to do some policy work. How can I do that within my organization? Remember now, all organizations have a policy framework too. And so you can alter organizational policy at your level. But I would go to my supervisor. I would join some of these advocacy groups that Jessica talked about, and try to engage in that way. We also can get our clients organized. We can serve as facilitators. It depends on the restrictions in your organization, but we can help organize our clients into an interest group, a political interest group. And that's very important. You see them every week or every day, even though they don't want to see you sometimes, but unless they court ordered, of course, that's different. But the bottom line is that that's another way that you can politicize your job as a micro or clinical practitioner, is to get your clients politicized.
Community organizing.
That's right.
As we used to call it.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. Barack Obama was a community organizer. Got started in the South Side of Chicago. So, yes, organizing. Rick, you and I think of the same generation.
Yeah, I've read a lot of the books by Saul Alinsky.
Yes. And now the political right has taken a page from Saul Alinsky. Isn't that interesting?
Well, techniques are techniques.
Come on, there you go. That's true.
Yeah. There's been a few more questions, and let me get to them. I sometimes have to go back and forth. Okay, so one question is, some people believe you have to pick one issue and put all your efforts towards making tangible change on that one issue. And although you can care about more things, your efforts have to be on one thing. Now, I know, Jessica, you had a few thoughts you shared, but Jerome, you haven't probably even seen the question. So should we specialize entirely, or shall we have several different topics? Jessica, since you have already looked at the question, why don't you start, and then Jerome will turn it over to you if you want to respond.
Yeah, so I had started by disagreeing with the, someone said that, I think someone else maybe who had spoken had said that the argument was that maybe you should only focus on one thing. Honestly, I think when you think about your time doing this work, you have to find what works for you. But I will say that my example, I was able to do several things. And even maybe the best example was when I was doing the NASW chapter work. We were able within one legislative session to affect change on a number of bills and a number of different topic areas. So I felt like in that role, it was kind of cool because I felt like we were able to kind of use our energy. And of course, it was a group, so we could share that the time of doing that. So sometimes I think you can do a number of things. And then other times, I think you're right. You just want to focus on one thing and just kind of really give all your attention to that. So I just don't think it's maybe there's a right or wrong here. I think you have to figure out at any given point in time how you want to use the resources that you have.
I agree with that 100%. I think it's fluid. So at some points you might want to be a generalist, at others a specialist. So that would be my comment, Rick.
Okay. Here's a question that is kind of based on a comment that Terry Mizrahi made. In the sense that there is such strong overlap in the US between class and race, particularly we know that African Americans are paid less and their social class SES status is lower. How do we tease those apart using the Afrocentric perspective? And are we wrong not to, I'm putting words in Terry's mouth here, so forgive me, but are we wrong to focus on race through the exclusion of class, or how do we mix those two?
Well, those two should be mixed. I mean, again, I'm not, let me just back up. I'm not totally opposed to intersectionality, as a individual, as a scholar. I was just critiquing it like any other perspective.
Yeah.
But from an Afrocentric perspective, white supremacy is seen as ubiquitous.
Mhm.
And there are different forms of white supremacy. And that people of color, in this case, African Americans and others, experience white supremacy, whether they are in the hood or in the ivory tower. And so white supremacy is robust, it's ubiquitous, it has this Archie Bunker form. Yeah, for those of you who remember All in the Family, the kind of experiences I had as a child was Archie Bunker type racism, right? But then there are more subtle and institutionalized forms. There's microaggressions. There's the lawyer at the black lawyer at the law firm who doesn't make partnership, and maybe is working 14 and 15 hours, but doesn't is unfairly assessed, and doesn't make partnership. Then you have microaggressions. Look, all of this, in fact, really, if you look at African Americans and our health status, social class is not as significant in explaining some of the health disparities, like cancer and other disease. In fact, social class doesn't appear to be as significant as race and some other factors in explaining health disparities. So it shows you how insidious racism and white supremacy is. You might think that the PhD who makes $120,000 a year is better off than the brother or sister who's homeless in the hood. Well, he or she is, because he or she is not homeless, but the stress of white supremacy might be even greater for Black professionals because they tend to work in predominantly white environments. Mm-hmm. And therefore their exposure to white supremacy is even greater in terms of some of the attitudes and behaviors that people have, which then can lead to enormous stress, which can manifest then into health problems like cancer. Mm-hmm. So that's the argument from an Afrocentric perspective, is the robustness and ubiquity of white supremacy in all of its sundry forms and manifestations. And it doesn't just hit people in the bottom worse than it does people on the top. It is a very insidious thing in America, not to dismiss, poverty and those problems too, but white supremacy is very, very ubiquitous, and that's the point of the Afrocentric perspective.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that for me. Again, I may have misinterpreted what Terry's comments were about when I phrased
Rick,
it.
Could I say something? Yeah, just to say because you did leave out the historic piece, so Jerome, what I remember of history, and I teach social policy, and I may be even a tad older than you. Malcolm X, although Sammy Davis's kiss to Archie Bunker was probably one of my favorite moments of all time on TV. But it was Malcolm X. What I wrote here was Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, George Wiley, who started the Poor People's Movement in the 70s, all began toward the end of their lives to switch from race to class. Not to deny that there's race, but saying racism is what kept poor whites and Blacks from getting together to form a class-based movement. So, and I just happened to watch the, some of the Malcolm X and the Muhammad Ali documentaries now. So it's like fresh in my mind to see some of that history and Malcolm X talking about when he went to the Middle East, seeing white folks, who were Muslim, and kind of it's all like reinterpretation. So it's not an either or for sure. It is a both. And I understand what you're saying about racism being ubiquitous. As a woman, sexism to me is ubiquitous. I certainly think it's intersectionality. And the question is, what's going to build some transformative change for people who are people of color and poor whites who are not living the American dream? That's what you said in the beginning. Your policies, the universal policy, certainly will go a long way if we could ever get the Democrats together. And I'm not afraid of talking politics here.
Right. Well, one of the things that has kept that alliance, first of all, we can debate about Malcolm X's, King and others may have been moving towards a race class piece, but Malcolm X came back and formed the Organization for African American Unity when he came back from Mecca. So he still remained race-centered from my vantage point. But one of the major barriers to bringing working class whites together with working class blacks has been racism. This is the problem right now, particularly with the Trump administration, is that some of the most racist, overtly racist Americans, unfortunately, are whites with non-college education. And the question has been, this has been the problem all along. How do you deal with those people who obviously are being manipulated too by the white elite? But how do you get them to assuage or eliminate their own racist attitudes to join forces with Black people? So far, it hasn't been done, not in a massive way. It has not been done. And I really think, quite frankly, it's because of the ubiquity of racism and how insidious it is in American society. I wish it could happen, for sure. I wish it could be more convergence there. But it seems to me, and this, I'm going back to Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, and he argued that yes, poor whites and poor Blacks should come together. But then he talked about the wages of whiteness, right? The wages of whiteness. And essentially that even poor whites, they may not have a pot to piss in, but they still have their whiteness to hold on to. Now, how do you destroy that as an incentive? I don't know. You see? How do you destroy that? How do you undermine that? The wages of whiteness. Here's this white person, no education, no health care, don't even want other people. They could have health care and be beneficial, but they oppose universal health care because they think other people would get it. Right? Now that is just crazy. But that's the kind of psychopathology that is a consequence, unfortunately, of the ubiquity of racism in American society. So I hope that could happen, but race is too powerful for many people for it to happen. And I don't see it happening in my lifetime, maybe in Rick's lifetime, but not in mine.
Jerome, I'm older than you are, so hopefully you'll outlive me too.
Right, but that's a very good question about it. But this has been an age-old issue. And let me just say, I started out as a Marxist in college. This is why I cited Mills and others. And then, of course, the Frankfurt School, all of that was very, very important for me. Mm-hmm. But trying to get people together on social class, you have to deal with the racism first. Yeah. And if you don't deal with the racism first or the psychological wages of racism, then you have people like Donald Trump who will exploit it. And he exploited it perfectly. I know, we already have politicized this thing, but he did exploit it perfectly. And it mushroomed into January 6th, 2021. And we all remember that, even though they're trying to dismiss it now. Even former Vice President Pence, who they were saying, hang him.
Well, I hate to interrupt this particular train of thought. Terry, thank you for raising it and for clarifying and expanding on your comments. There's one more question I want to get to so that we can kind of end on a moving forward note. And that is that there's several people in the audience who are talking about where do they get training in social justice policy work, and what's the best way forward for the people in the audience and social work education on a larger scale. So Jerome, do you want to take that, and then we'll close off with Jessica?
Well, I would think try to identify some professional associations that focus on that. Rick, do you have a professional association that focuses on policy practice?
Well, there are several policy groups like influencing state policy or social policy, and
right.
Yeah, things like that. NASW has some.
Yeah, and then each professional organization has a policy track. Like NASW has the policy, whatever they call it, and CSW has the same thing. And so you can find those sub tracks or subdivisions within the larger professional organization. But I think because there's been so much attention now on racial disparities, and now CSWE has changed this EPOD, that is this educational standards, to focus more on anti-racism. And not that racism is the only policy issue, but of course, it's central from my vantage point. But the bottom line is that I think being a part of larger organizations, there have been no social movements without social organizations. Mm. And so you can engage in your own individual efforts, but it's always best to be a member of something that is advocating for a worthy cause that you care a lot about.
What great words of wisdom there, and I think sometimes like NASW gets knocked for not being this or not being that, but it truly can be the voice of the social workers who are active in it. So let me just underscore my complete agreement with the necessity for group-based advocacy. Jessica, I'm going to turn the last word over to you here.
Great. Yeah, I have a few ideas. So take advantage of your policy classes while you're in school. More and more professors are teaching from a practice, instead of teaching policy as really theoretical, they're starting to teach it more as a policy practice class, which I do and others do. So there's a lot of skill building that happens in those classes. Internships, think about at the BSW and MSW level that you do a policy focused internship. Volunteer with advocacy organizations, campaigns, the NASW Legislative Committee. I learned so much just from volunteer work. And then University of Houston and University of Connecticut are both universities that have special tracks for political social work. And I think, isn't it, Rick, is it University of Connecticut that does the campaign school?
Yes.
So that's also another resource. I don't know if there's a way to share out the campaign school. But yeah, those are all ideas I would throw out there.
Well, I know that we've had Shannon Lane and Suzanne Prisker and many other people earlier today talk about the political social work, and the campaign school certainly is a wonderful way. Let me just underscore, I think the need for CSWE and educational institutions to take more seriously the need and the desire of students to know how to impact policy. And if nothing else is accomplished by SPEAK, I would just love to see more and more emphasis on social policy, education, advocacy, and knowledge. And these are all the things that, according to the civic engagement model, you need time, you need resources, such as time and money. You need engagement, which is, why does this matter to you? What's your psychological engagement? And then you need networks. And so lean on your professors or your colleagues for those networks. Join the organizations like NASW and other groups. And I think that will also help us combat burnout, because when we try to do things on our own, it takes forever if we ever even see any change at all. So I think, in addition to what Jessica said, join groups, be active, but I think it was Terry yesterday who said, self-care is community. And if we look around us at our people who are in our tribe and are interested in the same topic and advocacy, I think that helps prevent burnout incredibly well. Oh man, this has been such a great session, and I'm just again buzzing with ideas. And so I want to thank both of you, Jessica and Jerome, for your stimulating, idea-generating questions, presentations. So gratitude goes to all of you for being here, and I hope that it inspires you to do more even than you have before. So with that, I'll say adieu, farewell, on Wiedersehen, and thank you all very much.